Hello, and welcome to this episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds. Today, we're joined by Monique Oxender, the Chief Sustainability Officer and Interim Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Keurig Dr. Pepper, also known and we'll refer to in today's show as KDP. Monique joined KDP in 2012 and has navigated the path of integrating sustainability management throughout the company. On today's episode, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the interconnectedness of ESG issues and how to take a strategic approach to driving meaningful impact on both business and the world. Monique, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mandi.
So wonderful to have you. I know last summer we had a chance to meet at The Economist, and I pulled you aside and I said, I'm thankful for your transparency because your session was about ambition meeting action and setting real, tangible goals. In your latest sustainability report, you talked about the fact that many environmental and social impact issues in today's world are complex but interconnected. What a key word, interconnected. So let's start there for our audience listening in. What do you mean when you say ESG issues are fundamentally intersectional?
Yeah, the way I look at it is humans, we really try to understand the world by putting things into discrete boxes. And we do that first to understand, but then eventually we get to the point where we want to start to measure and manage the most important boxes that we've constructed. I think that when you put this concept into practice with sustainability management within industry and businesses, you really quickly start to observe that the social and environmental challenges and opportunities that we have in front of us, they do not fit discrete boxes, right? And making a change in one box is going to impact the one next to it, or maybe the one across the room, or the one high up on the shelf. You just sometimes don't always know if you're not aware of that intersectionality or interconnectedness. So, for us, I think recognizing the interconnectedness where you can and being open to it when it arises is a real opportunity for businesses, for sustainability leaders to better integrate ESG and sustainability strategies into the business and into the overall corporate strategy.
I appreciate that. I love how you dove into it and acknowledged it in your report at Workiva. We did the same with our own practice. So, pro tip for those out there is to really think about calling that out in your materiality matrix, right? Or materiality section, because that's the first place where it starts. Yes, we have prioritization of issues, impact on business and society. And to your point, people like to look at it as a box or check the box of hierarchy. And we as leaders need to start challenging that paradigm. So thank you for your leadership in that space. Let's unpack this a little bit more for those listening in today, because your corporate responsibility platform, Drink Well, Do Good, was unveiled in 2019. So less than 1 year after a merger that just happened at your company, Keurig Green Mountain and Dr. Pepper Snapple. So Drink Well, Do Good, it outlines 4 pillars for those listening in on our audience, covering different impact areas such as environment, supply chain, health, well-being, and communities. So how did you arrive to those 4 pillars? And then again, as we talk about intersectionality, how did these connect to one another?
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of backed up. Who are we? As Keurig Dr. Pepper, we are now leading producer and distributor of hot and cold beverages. But in coming together in 2018, it was a really unique and different opportunity where we were able to leverage expanded operations, a broad community presence, and combined resources to start down this path, which we eventually, called our Drink Well, Do Good platform. The other thing that I like to kind of build into the context of how did we arrive at that platform and those pillars is we do have a unique footprint that's I always keep top of mind when I'm talking to folks. Our operations are really centered in North America. We, of course, have a global and really diverse supply chain, but from a marketplace point of view, an operational point of view, we're really centered in North America and primarily in the US. So the work that we're doing, it spans the entire value chain. It's the farmers, the suppliers, the commercial partners, employees, consumers, retailers, communities, right? The list goes on and on. But the broad engagement that we have across that value chain is what creates those opportunities to make a positive impact, which is what our ambition is all about, right? A positive impact with every drink. As we engaged as a new company, 2018, 2019, with those stakeholders, we did that exercise, that ESG materiality assessment, which, to be clear, is a very different definition from financial materiality, right? It's looking at priorities and impacts across our value chain. And then what emerged are these priority issues that informed the pillars that we use today that you kind of listed there: the environment, supply chain, health and well-being, and people and communities. Those sound like four nice boxes, but they're not, right? There's significant degree of overlap between the pillars. I can give you a quick example, right? There's been a lot of attention on nature, big capital N nature. Well, we don't have a pillar called nature. We don't have any goals that specifically call out the term nature. And yet, we're using nature-based solutions to achieve water replenishment, to build climate resiliency, to implement regenerative agriculture and conservation practices. And one of the related impacts of nature-based solutions is oftentimes improvements in the lives of people who live and work in the watersheds or on the farms where we're doing the regenerative agriculture. And this is just a great example of where there's really interconnectedness, not just in the pillars, but around the issues and the impacts as well.
So, as we think about those four pillars, talk to us about how are you looking at these different goals then as interconnected as you talk with your different stakeholders?
Yeah, well, I mentioned our ambition is to make a positive impact with every drink. And the only way that we know whether we're making progress or not is by setting goals, and that those goals are supported by a robust measurement and an evaluation system. So internally, the goals drive action. They're incredibly important in that sense. Externally, they clearly communicate the positive impact that we intend to have. And I think being really, really clear on broad terms like impact is really important. So, it's worth mentioning, going back to when we met, last summer, Mandi, when we set a goal at KDP, we have a glide path behind each goal and how we intend to get there. We don't set aspirational goals and then afterwards try to figure out how we're going to meet them. Now, that doesn't mean we have a crystal ball that tells us everything that's going to happen in the context of daily operations or external environment. So we have to revisit those glide paths year over year and adjust, as needed. But there are really clear connections between some of the goals and associated glide paths that are interdependent. And if something changes in the external environment or in our ability to execute on an operational change, it might not just impact one goal, it could impact several. I think the easy, example to kind of grasp, because it's all within our direct footprint and control, is we have 2025 goals on achieving recyclability for our packaging, reducing virgin plastic use, and increasing recycled content. Those are all design changes that we can control. Each one of those has a follow-on impact in terms of emissions, whether an emissions increase or an emissions reduction, depending on the decisions that we're making in any kind of trade-offs. So we have to do that in tandem with our climate glide path.
So, whether our listeners listening in, they know you have a positive impact every time they take a drink like me of Canada Dry, Club Soda, or Verner's, which is one of my favorite ginger ales, Green Mountain Coffee that I start my day with. Tell us how you're thinking about the supply chain. You unlocked that a little bit more in your previous answer. And I'm curious, what are the challenges that you're facing and how you've seen this work create a positive impact when we address both a social environmental issue in the supply chain?
Yeah, and the supply chain is the perfect place to witness the intersectionality, right? Especially across those environmental and social impacts, the people and the places. They're very connected and intertwined. It's also even more challenging to manage that interconnectedness in the supply chain because your degree of influence versus control is very, very different than the example I just gave around packaging design changes. We do have a very global and diverse supply chain. I'll give you sort of the examples that we're working most actively in: apples, coffee, and corn. Individual supply chains are, all three of them, constantly changing. They're complicated, really regional challenges. I mean, just look at the differences between a tropical and a temperate growing environment, a tree crop and a row crop, very different kinds of agriculture required. And then also across all three, different combinations of farmers and farm labor, which, from a living income and living wage issue point of view, are very different dynamics in play there. So we're dealing with this complexity on an individual supply chain level, but our goals are at the enterprise level. So we have to be able to measure and report on an aggregated level across those supply chains. So some of the complexity that we're trying to manage when it comes to supply chain. Our supply chain approach is really a resiliency oriented approach, which deals with both, obviously, the business resiliency, the environmental resiliency, especially in the light of a changing climate, and then the livelihood. Are farmers and producers able to actually make a livelihood with a particular crop across any of those three I just mentioned? We have a foundation of responsibly sourced. So you're just meeting the basic social and environmental criteria that we're laying out in our responsibly sourced guidelines or applicable standards like Rainforest Alliance, right? And then it builds from there, because meeting basic requirements isn't enough. And what showed us it's not enough, it was some of those interconnected impacts that we saw relative to the natural landscapes. So that's where it led us to regenerative agriculture and conservation practices, and then also improving livelihoods. These all go sort of hand in hand. And those are more or less anticipated or learned interconnections in our supply chain that we're managing across a set of goals that can all enhance each other. There's also then bridges out to climate impacts, water impacts, which, yeah, they exist in a different pillar, right? A different communications construct, so to speak, but they're all playing into each other and managed cohesively.
So, Monique, let's switch gears from that external stakeholder environment when we look at the supply chain to thinking about intersectionality influence at KDP with internal operations and resources. So, like your personal teams and data systems, how have you chosen to invest there to address some of these issues?
I think striving to understand the connections between some of these issues and impacts, it's led us to engagement in different parts of the business. And it's actually helped us further our own integration of sustainable business practices and planning throughout the business. It started conversations that we hadn't necessarily anticipated in the initial stages of establishing, for example, the Drink Well Do Good platform. Sometimes it happens in reverse as well, though. Sometimes an unanticipated impact in the business surfaces through a team coming forward to us, wanting to have the conversation because they're trying to navigate priorities and potential conflicts of, wait, I've got to do this over here, but I'm seeing I also have a energy efficiency goal or a water use reduction goal, and help me navigate these tensions. One of the really kind of live examples that we're dealing with right now that's driven very deep engagement around different parts of our business is the scope 3 conversation combined with, climate urgency in general. I had a colleague come to me recently and say, hey, give me an update. What are you guys doing on scope 3? And I said, interestingly, we're actually focused a little more on scope 1 than scope 3 right now because of fleet, right? We have a significant fleet owned and operated in the United States where infrastructure and technology are not necessarily where we need them to be on the timeline required for some of the goal setting and standards we're trying to meet from a science-based point of view. But that's not scope 3 for us. And that's really a little bit confounding for people because so many other people are dealing with transportation and logistics in their scope 3, right? So there's an interesting point of connection and collaboration that we can and should be pursuing. But at the same time, it's really interesting conversations internally between our supply chain fleet, which operates in one way with one set of assets between and amongst our own operations, and our direct store delivery fleet, which operates very differently with a very different set of assets and trucks that they're operating. So lots of interesting conversations from which we're learning and identifying, hey, where do we start? Where is it going to be maybe easier and more attainable and more impactful to start versus achieving scale over time, which is going to be a greater reliance on external factors, including policy.
How fascinating. So let's dive into another internal stakeholder and talk about the increasingly robust governance structure that's needed. Tell us about your own governance structure and what role does it play in the oversight that you need to execute on this incredible strategy?
Mandi, I actually feel really fortunate that we are a newer company in the sense that we merged in 2018. We got to build governance from scratch. And of course, the legacy companies had great governance structures as well. But we were able to hit restart at a point of integration of two companies and build something that was appropriate for now and the future. And I think that's reflected well in exactly what you're talking about, this changing landscape where emerging regulation is putting a finer point on the need for robust governance. So our governance structure is based on cross-functional operating teams that do reflect that intersectional nature of the issues. So when we're working on sustainable supply chains, we've got representation from procurement, from quality, from the sustainability team, from marketing, from research and development and formulations, right? From legal. Across the board, we were able to harness all of the different players from an operational structure, and that feeds up then to our sustainability governance committee, which meets very regularly and includes select leadership team members and other key leaders throughout the organization to provide the cross-functional decision making and alignment, ensure that alignment with the business strategy. And then ultimately, our board of directors oversees our ESG strategy writ large, the goals, and especially, obviously, the public goals and progress.
You lightly touched on ESG global regulation, and I want to ask a little bit more here about the SEC climate disclosure rules continuing to be introduced and proposed. How is that impacting the way a company like yours is approaching their governance?
Between the regulation and then how that regulation also cascades and impacts through your supply chain. So your customers asking for information as consistent with the regulation that they are beholden to. Across that board, we're seeing continued pressure for bold commitments coupled with increased scrutiny on ESG commitments and claims. So it's a real fine balancing act between stakeholder demand for action and yet also really clear substantiation for claims and disclosures relative to your commitments. So transparency is absolutely key here. It has to be built in from the start and follow all the way through with each one of those progress updates that you're providing, be that to a customer, be it to a regulatory agency, be it in your voluntary reporting. But ultimately, we are a very action-oriented company, right? Action is maybe my favorite word. Maybe I overuse it. I don't know, Mandi. But if we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it, and we have a plan to get there. And it honestly makes that transparency piece so much easier to have that forethought and engagement throughout your business to be able to both commit to and execute.
So let's talk about measurement. KDP includes measurement as it relates to all of its social and environmental impacts within your Drink Well, Do Good corporate responsibility platform. How are you thinking about measurement, monitoring, and ensuring the integrity of the intersection of your data to get better visibility for impact? Talk to us about that.
So I feel really strongly you got to define a methodology up front. And that can be informed by a benchmark because for a lot of these practices, there's already a methodology established. maybe it's emerging, and waiting for it to come full bright is the wise move to make before, setting any kind of target for the company. But in most cases, always preferable for a common approach or a standard across an industry. In the beverage industry, we have some great examples of where that's working so well. The Beverage Industry Environmental Roundtable has done a fantastic job of harnessing data and metrics across methodologies across the industry. The Global Coffee Platform is another great example of standardizing what does it mean to responsibly source coffee and what platform certifications, verifications would qualify as such. So I think that those are great examples of really coalescing behind a common methodology for measurement and then establishing a baseline. Knowing where you're starting from is incredibly important. When we launched Drink Well, Do Good, we were able to affirm or reaffirm some existing goals that the companies had, and where we had a good base of data in that baseline, we were able to also set some new goals. But we also took the liberty of a pause to say, hey, in some areas, we need more data from across the organization. We're going to take a pause before we set, for example, new climate goals, which we didn't do until 2020, because we needed to gather more data and understand that baseline a little bit better to then be able to move into that third step of setting goals and KPIs. Lesson learned there, those KPIs sometimes need to exist in a hierarchy so that they're a good balance of both leading and lagging indicators so that you can drive appropriate action and progress across the operations, and then ultimately delivering on transparency, including for your methodology. So we do publish a goal methodology table in the back of our corporate responsibility report every year to drive for that transparency. Additionally, we have in some cases a measurement and evaluation guide that not only provides the clarity of how did we measure progress towards a goal, but it provides that guidance up front for our implementing partners, particularly in the supply chain. We did it for our livelihoods goal that we met in 2020, improving livelihoods of people in our coffee supply chain. And we did it again with our regenerative agriculture goal, so that as we worked with implementing partners from the very onset, it was clear what we needed to measure, at what cadence, and to be able to get that back and ensure the validity of the progress and impact.
Let's get really practical, because I think you have a unique perspective where you got to hit reset a little bit on the governance structure, and you can be so close to this moment. I think you can give our listeners who are wondering, okay, if I took a step back, how can I determine how or if there is social and environmental overlap? So, what do you think they can do to begin to recognize intersectionality in their strategy and set it up to drive meaningful results?
I believe that an ESG materiality assessment, if done well, can do that for you, can be a tool towards identifying that. Now, when I say done well, I think those who are, for example, taking on board CSRD requirements now and having to take a different look at how they're doing their materiality assessment, it's taking us further down that path of doing it well, but it involves stakeholder engagement. It involves actually listening to those perspectives and understanding the impacts across the value chain. In lieu of a materiality assessment, I've also seen companies really take success in learning from their enterprise risk management approach. And so that's an existing tool or existing place that companies can start as well. It shouldn't replace necessarily, or ultimately a ESG materiality assessment, but I do think it's also a useful tool in the process. I mentioned listening to your stakeholders, which I do think is incredibly important because so many of the issues that we're dealing with have a lot of emotion tied to them and perception versus the reality and the measured impact. And you do have to take into account both, right? You can't look at any one of those in isolation. You do have to take into account both and really understand both direct and indirect impacts where possible. Where do you have influence versus control? And in both situations, there's still levers that you can pull to affect impact. They're just different levers. So really understanding, and not just, the sustainability leader, the sustainability team, but those throughout the business that are going to ultimately be delivering on the progress to goals. They need to understand those levers and which of them are affecting direct versus indirect kind of impacts for these issues that we're managing. In the end, a lot of these issues, especially given the interconnected nature of them, it's going to take a long time. We're talking about long time frames, which is why you see goal time horizons, out to 2030, 2040, 2050. But investments that are long term and data driven are great ways to address some of these systemic solutions that are needed, and then collaboration, right? Because especially where you only have influence and not a whole lot of direct control, that collaboration is a huge unlock.
Well, Monique, how delightful to see you again. And what a joy for our listeners to hear this perspective of intersectionality and connectivity and really thinking thoughtfully about their long term impact. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mandi.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll talk soon.